Welcome back to Investing Talk Podcast. It's fantastic to have you all with us as we take a look at a company that's definitely generating some serious buzz. XPeng.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting one, really. Whether you're a seasoned investor or just starting to dip your toes into the world of electric vehicles, XPeng's story is worth a closer look.
I think you're right. I mean, their stock, just to give you an idea, it surged almost 100% since the start of the year.
Mm-hmm.
It's currently sitting around, let me check, $23.60. That's a pretty big jump.
It is. I've even seen some analyses citing gains closer to 256%. Pretty impressive, especially compared to, broader market indices like the S&P 500. So the question is, what's driving this, remarkable performance?
Well, one thing that jumps out at me, and maybe this is an obvious place to start, is just how impressive their delivery numbers are.
You're absolutely right. We're not talking about incremental growth here. XPeng is setting records, like actually breaking records for deliveries, and in some cases, even surpassing Tesla in terms of, comparable models.
Interesting, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, just look at January. They delivered 30,350 vehicles. That's hold on, 268% increase year over year.
Wow, it's a lot of cars. The ones I keep hearing about are their MONA M03 and their P7 Plus sedan. They seem to be doing really well.
They are. Over 15,000 MO3 units were delivered last month alone, and the P7 Plus sedan, that one's already sold 20,000 units in 2 months.
That's real market traction. It's not just hype, it's actual people buying and, using their vehicles.
It is. And what's even more interesting is, XPeng isn't just about making cars. They're actually investing, pretty significantly in honestly, some pretty futuristic technologies.
That's right. From what I've read, it looks like they could be investing something like $13.8 billion in, wait for it, humanoid robots.
Yeah.
And they're even planning to mass produce flying cars, I think, by 2026.
You heard that right, flying cars. It sounds like something straight out of, science fiction.
It does.
But XPeng seems, really committed to making that vision a reality. And I think that signals something really important. It tells us that they're not content with just being an automaker. They want to be, a real tech leader, a pioneer.
So they're thinking beyond self-driving cars, maybe aiming for something even bigger.
I think so. Think about a future where your car, it's not just a car, it's part of this interconnected, AI-driven ecosystem. It's definitely a bold vision, and it definitely raises the question, are they on the absolute cutting edge, or are they, maybe getting a little bit ahead of themselves?
That's a really good question. And it seems like that's something that Wall Street analysts are, wrestling with right now. Some are incredibly optimistic, some are a bit more cautious.
Definitely. I mean, you've got Citi, for example. They've upgraded their rating to a buy, clearly impressed with, XPeng's growth. And this is especially noteworthy, I think, because it comes after Goldman Sachs actually downgraded them to neutral late last year. On the other hand, you have Bernstein, and they're holding a hold rating with a target price of just $14, which is significantly lower than, where the stock's trading right now.
That's a pretty big gap. What do you think is behind that kind of discrepancy?
Well, part of it might have to do with XPeng's valuation. Right now, they're trading at a, get this, 432% premium. And I think that makes some analysts, a little uneasy. Even Bank of America, they're more bullish, with a price target of $18.60. But even that seems, a bit conservative given the current price.
So for those of our listeners who are thinking about, investing in XPeng, how should they make sense of all this?
It's a great question. I think it really comes down to, your individual risk tolerance. Are you comfortable investing in a company that might be, overvalued? Or do you prefer a more, I guess you could say, a more cautious approach? It's a tough call. There are good arguments to be made on both sides.
It is tough. On one hand, you've got this, dynamic company. They're showing huge growth. They have these really ambitious goals. But on the other hand, are they growing too fast?
All right.
Is it sustainable?
Right. And to make things even more, I guess, complicated, there are these external factors, these things outside of XPeng's control that could have a big impact on their future.
So let's talk about those. Our research has highlighted a few key, areas of risk and opportunity that I think investors should really be aware of.
Definitely. First, you have competition. I mean, the electric vehicle market, it's getting crowded, right? You've got companies like BYD, and they're putting real pressure on XPeng to keep innovating.
Right.
For instance, BYD is now offering free smart driving features that could, force XPeng to, I don't know, maybe step up their game even more.
And then there's XPeng's, their international strategy. They just launched the X9 in Malaysia, and they were showcasing their, that flying car at MWC25, which is a huge global tech event. So clearly they're thinking big, right? They want to be a global player.
They do. But international expansion, it always comes with its own, unique challenges.
Of course. And then, we can't forget about, I guess, the elephant in the room, right? U.S.-China relations, the trade tensions, the possibility of new tariffs. That could all have a pretty big impact on XPeng's ability to access certain markets. So the question for our listeners, and I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts on this. Given all of these factors, where do you see the most potential for XPeng, and, what risks are you most concerned about?
Yeah, it's a lot to consider, really. It's a very complex situation. It is. It's a lot to think about. But, I think that's part of what makes investing so interesting, right?
I agree. There's always like this element of, uncertainty. You have to kind of weigh the risks against the potential rewards.
And speaking of risks and rewards, I think we should probably talk about, some of the recent volatility we've seen in XPeng's stock price.
It has been a bit of a roller coaster, just from a, purely technical perspective. On March 10th, the stock closed at $22.95, which is down 2.75% from the day before. But, and this is interesting, on that same day, it swung by more than 6%, hitting a low of $22.61 and a high of $23.98.
Yeah, it's definitely been a volatile time for XPeng. But even with, those ups and downs, the stock is still up significantly from where it started the year.
That's true. Over the past 2 weeks, it's gained, I think, something like 26.52%.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's that year-to-date gain of almost 100%. I mean, there's no question. There's a lot of, positive momentum there.
There is. But I think it's important to be, a little bit cautious. We don't want to get too caught up in, short-term trends. As investors, we need to look beyond the hype and really understand, like, the fundamentals of the business.
You're right. It can be easy to get swept up in, what's hot right now. But we really need to, like you said, focus on the fundamentals, understand what's actually driving the stock price.
Yeah.
And whether that, that momentum, whether it's sustainable.
And to figure that out, I think it's helpful to, look at some of the technical indicators. One of the key ones, of course, is trading volume. And what we saw on March 10th was really interesting. The volume spiked 18 million shares, even though the price was actually going down. And that, increased volume on a down day, it suggests that there might be some underlying selling pressure.
So could this be a sign that, that maybe that upward trend that it's starting to, I don't know, lose a little bit of steam?
It's definitely possible. I mean, the 3-month average volume is around 10.75 million shares. So this recent activity, it's above average. It tells us there's a lot of interest in XPeng, but it also, raises the possibility of maybe a reversal if that selling continues.
Right. Okay, so what about other technical indicators, like the moving averages, for example? What do those tell us?
Well, the 50-day simple moving average is right around $17.65. And that's, significantly lower than the current price. So that suggests a pretty strong short-term uptrend. And the 200-day moving average, that's even lower, somewhere between $13 and $14, which tells us that the long-term trend is also bullish.
So it sounds like both the short-term and the long-term trends are looking positive. That's, that's encouraging. But what about the relative strength index, the RSI? Is that giving us any reason to, to be concerned?
It's hard to say for sure without knowing, the exact number, but given the recent price surge and, just all the buzz around XPeng, it's probably somewhere between, I'd say, 70 and 80.
Okay, and so what does that mean?
Well, an RSI above 70, that's generally considered to be an overbought territory. It doesn't necessarily mean that, a downturn is imminent, but it does suggest that, maybe a correction is coming, especially when you consider that pivot top we saw on March 7th.
A pivot top. Can you explain what that is for, for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term?
Sure. A pivot top, it's basically it's a bearish reversal pattern. It happens when a stock, it hits a new high and then it reverses course. And that can be a signal that, maybe the trend is shifting from an uptrend to a downtrend. So
you've got the high RSI, you've got this pivot top. I mean, those could be warning signs, right?
They could be. But it's important to remember that, technical indicators, they're not foolproof. They're not crystal balls. They give us insights. They can give us, potential warning signs, but they don't guarantee what's going to happen with the price. The truth is, the way XPeng stock moves, it's going to depend on, a whole bunch of things. Their financial performance, obviously, but also, market conditions, investor sentiment. It's complicated.
It is, and I think that's a really important point to remember. Technical analysis, it can be a helpful tool, but it's just one piece of the puzzle. We always have to consider it alongside, other factors like the company's fundamentals, the overall market environment, all of that.
Exactly. And speaking of fundamentals, I think the event that everyone is really waiting for is XPeng's earnings report. It's coming out on March 18th, and that's going to give us a much clearer picture of, their financial health, whether this growth that we're seeing, whether it's really sustainable.
It is. It's going to be a big one. That earnings report, it's really going to help us, separate the hype from reality. We'll get insights into their revenue growth, their profitability, their outlook for the future. And that's all, crucial information for investors.
It is. The market's going to be, watching those numbers very, very carefully. It'll be interesting to see how they compare to, what analysts are expecting.
So to kind of sum up where we are right now, it seems like XPeng, they have huge potential. They're operating in this, rapidly growing market, but there are also risks, right? There's competition, there are these geopolitical tensions, and then there's always, the possibility of a market correction.
It's true. It's a complex situation, a lot of moving parts, and it requires, careful consideration.
Absolutely. And as we've been discussing, while those technical indicators can give us some insights, the real test is going to be whether XPeng can, deliver on their promises, whether they can execute on this ambitious growth strategy that they've laid out.
I agree. And I think that brings us to another really interesting aspect of XPeng's story, which is their push into these cutting edge technologies beyond just, traditional electric vehicles. They're not just making cars, they're investing a lot of money in robotics and flying cars. It's pretty remarkable.
It is. I mean, that potential $13.8 billion investment in humanoid robots, that tells us that they really want to be, a leader in technological innovation. And then you have that plan to mass produce flying cars by 2026. I mean, that's definitely capturing people's imaginations. I think it does.
But it also makes you wonder, are they maybe spreading themselves a little thin? I mean, it's great to be ambitious, but are they trying to do too much too quickly?
That's a fair point. I mean, diversifying to new technologies, it could give them, a competitive advantage. It could position them as like a leader in the future of mobility, as we've been talking about.
Yeah.
But it could also be a distraction, right? It could take their focus away from, their core business, which is making and selling electric vehicles. Right. It's a balancing act. They need to innovate. They need to stay ahead of the curve, but they also can't lose sight of, what they're good at.
Right. And I think investors are going to be watching very closely to see, how they manage that. It's a tough challenge.
It is. And of course, they're also, they're expanding globally. They just launched in Malaysia. They're participating in all these international tech events. So clearly they have, they have global aspirations.
They do. But again, global expansion, it's not easy. I mean, they're going to face competition from, established automakers in those markets in Europe, in North America. And then they have to deal with, all the complexities of different regulatory environments, different customer preferences. It's a lot to handle.
It is. But if they can pull it off, the payoff could be huge.
That's the big question, isn't it? Can they overcome those challenges and really, become a global player? We'll have to wait and see.
It's a great story, though. You have this, young, ambitious company. They're taking on these giants in a really dynamic industry. I think it's the kind of story that, that investors love. And, of course, tech enthusiasts, too.
Yeah, it's got a lot of drama, a lot of intrigue. It's a story of, promise, but also uncertainty. But I think one thing's for sure, XPeng is not afraid to take risks, to dream big.
And that's what makes them, so interesting. I think they're a really, really fascinating case study for anyone who's interested in, the future of transportation, the future of technology, all of that.
I agree. They represent, that spirit of innovation, that willingness to embrace new technologies. And they're coming from, this emerging market that's really, really shaking things up. It's exciting.
It is. So for our listeners who are thinking about investing in XPeng, what are some key takeaways they should keep in mind?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember that, investing in any company, especially a company like XPeng, it's risky. There's no guarantee that you're going to make money. And it's really important to understand, both the upside and the downside.
Yeah, that's good advice. Never invest more than you can afford to lose. And always do your own research before you make any decisions.
Exactly. You need to really understand the company's financials, their competition, who's running the company, their long-term strategy, all of that.
And then I think it's also important to be patient. Investing it's a long game. You're going to see those short-term fluctuations in the stock price. That's normal, but you have to focus on, the long-term potential.
I agree. It's not about, trying to time the market or make a quick buck. It's about finding companies that have, strong fundamentals, a history of innovation, of growth, and then you hold on to those investments, for the long haul.
And XPeng, I mean, with their focus on technology, their global ambitions, they're definitely a company, to keep an eye on.
I think so. They're a real disruptor in the auto industry, and it's going to be really interesting to see, what they do in the next few years.
All right. Before we move on, I just want to remind everyone that, this podcast is for informational purposes only. This is not investment advice. It's really important to talk to a qualified financial advisor before you make any investment decisions.
Yeah, that's an important disclaimer. We're here to, share our thoughts, our analysis, but ultimately, it's up to each individual investor to make their own decision.
Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about XPeng's competition.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not the only player in the electric vehicle market, right? There are a lot of other companies out there, big companies, small companies, all vying for market share.
Yeah, it's a crowded space. You've got, the established automakers like Tesla, Volkswagen, GM. They're all, making their move into EVs. And then you have, these up and coming companies like BYD, NIO. They're all hungry.
So what are some of like XPeng's key advantages? What do they do well? What sets them apart from the rest of the pack?
I think one of their biggest strengths is their focus on, on technology. They've invested a lot in, advanced driver assistance systems, autonomous driving, their in-car entertainment systems, and that really appeals to, to a certain type of customer, the tech-savvy customer.
That makes sense. It's clear that they're committed to innovation, and that seems to be, resonating with people. But what about their pricing? I mean, how do they compare to their competitors in terms of affordability?
I think their pricing is generally considered to be, pretty competitive. They offer, a range of models at different price points, so they're trying to appeal to, a wide range of customers. They're not the cheapest option out there, but I think they offer good value for the money in terms of the features, the technology, the performance, all of that.
And what about their brand image, their reputation? I mean, how are they perceived by consumers compared to some of their competitors?
I think they're still a relatively young company, so their brand image is still, it's still developing, but they've made some real progress in, in building a reputation for innovation, for quality, for customer satisfaction. They're very focused on the user experience, on making sure that, that owning an XPeng is a smooth, enjoyable experience. And that's earned them some praise from industry experts and from customers as well.
So it sounds like they're on the right track in terms of, building a strong brand. And that's really important for long-term success, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a strong brand, that's crucial for any company, but especially in a market like the auto industry, which is so competitive.
Right. And speaking of competition, I think we have to, address the elephant in the room, which is Tesla. I mean, how does XPeng stack up against the industry leader?
Yeah, Tesla, they're the undisputed leader in the EV market right now. And they've set a very, very high bar for everyone else in terms of innovation, in terms of performance, in terms of brand recognition. But I think XPeng, they're not afraid of the challenge. They see themselves as a serious contender, and they're definitely gaining market share, especially, in China, which is their home market.
So Tesla's still, the benchmark, but they're emerging as a real competitor, especially in some of these key growth markets.
Yeah. I think that's fair to say. And I think the competition between those two companies, it's going to be really, really interesting to watch over the next few years. And ultimately, I think it's going to be good for consumers. It's going to push both companies to innovate, to improve, to offer better products.
And that's good for everyone, right? I mean, more and more people are, they're embracing electric vehicles. They see them as a viable alternative to gasoline-powered cars.
They are. I mean, the EV revolution, it's happening, and XPeng is, they're right there in the thick of it.
Okay. So let's talk about XPeng's global expansion strategy. I mean, they've already, you know, they've already entered a few international markets, and they're talking about, expanding even further.
Yeah, they're ambitious. They're launch in Malaysia. That's a big step. And they've also mentioned, being interested in Europe and North America. So it's clear that they want to be a global player.
They do. But as we've talked about before, global expansion, it's not easy. There are a lot of challenges. What are some of the biggest hurdles that they're going to have to overcome?
I think one of the biggest challenges is, just the competition. They're going up against these established automakers in those markets. And they have to, they have to convince consumers to choose XPeng over these brands that they're already familiar with.
Yeah, they have to, make a case for themselves. They have to explain, what makes them different, what makes them better.
Exactly. They need to showcase their technology, their commitment to sustainability, their focus on the customer experience, all of that.
And then they also have to deal you know, with the regulations, right?
Yeah.
Every country has its own rules, its own standards. And then they have to, adapt their products and services to meet, the local demand, the local preferences.
Yeah, that's crucial. I mean, if you want to succeed in a new market, you have to, understand the customers. You have to give them what they want.
So it's a lot to juggle. It requires, careful planning. It requires execution. It requires a really deep understanding of, of the market, of the culture, all of that.
It does, and it'll be interesting to see, how they do, whether they can take what they've learned in China and, replicate that success in other parts of the world.
It's a story that's still being written. I mean, we don't know how it's going to end.
Yeah.
But it's definitely a compelling story.
Yeah.
It's a story of, ambition. It's a story of innovation. It's a story of, a company that's willing to take risks, that's willing to, to challenge the status quo.
It is. And it's a story that, it speaks to the power of innovation. It speaks to the importance of embracing new technologies. And it speaks to the potential of these emerging markets to really shake things up.
It does. And I think it's a story that resonates with, with investors, with tech enthusiasts, with anyone who's just, fascinated by the rapid pace of change that we're seeing in the auto industry.
I think so. XPeng, they're a company to watch, and
Yeah.
I think their story is going to, continue to be interesting for many, many years to come.
So as we kind of wrap up this section on XPeng, I just want to reiterate, that investing in the stock market, it always involves risk. And, past performance, it's not a guarantee of future results. It's so important to do your research, to diversify your portfolio, and to talk to a financial advisor before you make any decisions.
That's right. It's important to be, informed to be responsible.
Okay. So with that said, let's move on and talk a little bit about XPeng's foray into these cutting edge technologies. I mean, as we've touched on, they're not just building cars; they're investing heavily in robotics and even flying cars.
It's true. And that $13.8 billion investment in humanoid robots, that really tells you something about their commitment to being at the forefront of technological innovation. And then, that goal of mass producing flying cars by 2026, I mean, it's captivating, right?
It's been pretty fascinating, really kind of digging into XPeng's story and, trying to understand where they fit in this whole electric vehicle landscape that's, changing so rapidly.
It really has. We've covered a lot of ground, from their impressive delivery figures to their ambitious plans, in terms of technology, global expansion. It's a lot to take in. And I think it makes a really strong case, for investors who are looking at the electric vehicle market.
And one thing that I keep, thinking about is just like the contrast, right? You have
Yeah.
all this excitement about XPeng's potential, and then you have, some analysts who are, well, they're a little more cautious, right? They're talking about the valuation, the risks.
It's true. It's a good example of, that balance that investors always have to find, right? Recognizing the potential, but also being aware of the uncertainty, the fact that nothing is guaranteed.
Yeah. It's a reminder to, to do your homework, to really think things through before you jump in.
Absolutely. No investment is, completely risk-free. And it's really important to understand, both the potential upside and the potential downside before you make any decisions.
So for our listeners who are maybe intrigued by XPeng, who are thinking about, maybe adding them to their portfolio, what would be like your top, pieces of advice?
I think I'd give them three three main things to think about. First,
Yeah.
definitely pay attention to that earnings report that's coming out on March 18th. That's going to give us a much clearer picture of, their financials, how they're actually performing, and, whether this growth that we've been talking about, whether it's sustainable.
Okay, so that's number one. What else?
Number two, I'd say, keep an eye on the news, really. What's happening with their global expansion? How are those investments in those new technologies, the robotics, the flying cars, how's that all playing out? And of course, we can't forget about the US-China trade relationship, how that's evolving. All of those things, they could have a big impact on XPeng's future.
Yeah. Okay, so earnings report, news, and what's the third thing?
It's the third thing, and this is important for any investment. Don't get caught up in the hype. Don't just follow the crowd. Really, really understand the company's fundamentals, their competition, whether their business model, whether it makes sense in the long term. Make decisions based on, on facts, on analysis, not just emotion.
That's great advice. It's it's easy to get caught up in the excitement, especially when a company is doing well, when the stock is it's going up. But it's so important to stay grounded, to do your research.
Exactly. And that's really, that's what we try to do here on the podcast, right? Give people the information, the tools they need to make smart decisions.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into XPeng,
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that they're at kind of a crossroads, right?
Yeah.
They have a lot of potential. They have a lot of things going for them. The technology, the leadership, the market they're in. It's all very positive. But there are challenges, right? The competition, geopolitical situation, and just, the pressure of meeting these very high expectations.
It's true. It's an evolving story, and we don't know how it's gonna end.
Yeah.
But it's definitely going to be, an interesting one to watch. XPeng is trying to, to really make a mark on the global stage.
It's been great talking about this with you. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, your expertise with our listeners.
It's been my pleasure. I always, enjoy these conversations. It's fascinating to talk about these companies that are really pushing the boundaries.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you found this episode, informative, engaging. If you did, please, subscribe to the podcast, give us a like, leave a comment below. Let us know what you think about, XPeng's future. We always love hearing from you.
And until next time, happy investing.